The New York Times is certainly the most important newspaper in the United States, and one could argue the most important newspaper in the world. The New York Times plays an enormous role in shaping the perception of the current world on the part of the politically active, educated classes. Also, the New York Times has a special role, and I believe its editors probably feel that they bear a heavy burden.
Hey guys, this is a follow-up piece on my earlier reporting on the New York Times recent smear campaign against Bernie Sanders' 2020 candidacy. And I'm doing a follow-up because I've dug deeper into these journalists who were responsible for the smear campaign, and I found some really disturbing facts. I'll link below to my earlier video, but just for some basic context, back in 2016, the New York Times ran this article with the headline, "Bernie Sanders scored victories for years via legislative side doors." But they later replaced this article and changed the copy to make it much more anti-Sanders. In the second version, they changed the headline to read, "Via legislative side doors, Bernie Sanders won modest victories." So they took out "scored victories for years" and replaced it with "won modest victories." Now they also yanked out a bunch of positive sentiments that were expressed in the first piece and made the second piece, like I said, just really explicitly anti-Sanders. The New York Times bias against Bernie Sanders was so bad that in 2015, the Times' own public editor wrote, "For the Times, Bernie Sanders' entry into the presidential race was almost a non-event. Although many candidates' declarations were treated on the front page with considerable fanfare, Mr. Sanders was tucked inside the paper on page A21. Now, I don't want to throw around a bunch of general statements like the Times is biased against Bernie. Instead, I want to show you some specific examples that prove it. First, I want to turn your attention to the New York Times national political correspondent, Jonathan Martin. Back in 2016, a Forbes contributor, Lawrence Kotlikoff, wrote a piece saying, "The New York Times' Jonathan Martin is disguising opinion as news." And I'll link the piece below. If you go through it, it basically explains how in the 2016 primary, Jonathan Martin was putting out these pro-Clinton, anti-Sanders opinion pieces all under the guise of political news. Now, where things really get awkward for Jonathan Martin is the Wikileaks emails. If the Wikileaks show anything about the New York Times, it's that Jonathan Martin had a too close for comfort relationship with the Hillary Clinton campaign. In this email, we see that Martin had RSVP'd yes to a press dinner hosted by the Clinton campaign. In this email here, we see that Jonathan Martin had been reaching out to the most senior members of the Clinton campaign to warn them about stories that the New York Times was preparing to run. And in this email here, we learn two disturbing truths. First, that the New York Times was essentially working as a PR firm for the Clinton campaign. As a top staffer writes to another, there's a blog post from HRC on small businesses on LinkedIn that will go up tomorrow. New York Times will break that story. Then they continue, New York Times Jonathan Martin is planning to do a piece on our strategy. And they continue, Robbie Mook, the Clinton campaign manager, is going to talk to him to explain what we are doing. So the New York Times and the Hillary Clinton campaign were literally working together, and Hillary Clinton's campaign manager was coaching Jonathan Martin through this piece he's writing. Now, it would have been great if the New York Times just cut all ties with Jonathan Martin for clearly abandoning all objectivity in 2016. But instead of learning their lesson from 2016, the New York Times has Jonathan Martin out there right now writing Sanders hit pieces. In this one, Jonathan Martin writes, "Sanders has done little to broaden his political circle and has struggled to expand his appeal beyond his base of primarily white supporters," not backing up any of those claims with any evidence. I couldn't believe my eyes when I saw that the New York Times let Jonathan Martin get away with this one. Just a couple weeks ago, Martin for the New York Times writing, "For Bernie Sanders, holding on to support may be hard in a 2020 bid. You literally cannot make this shit up." The Times writes, "Mr. Sanders may have been the runner-up in the last Democratic primary, but instead of expanding his nucleus of support in the fashion of most repeat candidates, the Vermont senator is struggling to retain even what he garnered 2 years ago, when he was far less a political star than he is today. That in itself is a contradiction. The Times is saying that Sanders is more of a political star than he ever was, and yet he somehow doesn't have the support that he once had." But forget Wikileaks and Jonathan Martin and his conflicts of interest. Let's talk about the co-author of this piece, Sydney Ember. Because Sydney Ember is the very same author behind all three of these recent New York Times Sanders hit pieces. In the first one she put out very recently, Sydney Ember writes, "Sanders has been outflanked on the left by rising stars like Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez and Beto O'Rourke. His stronghold on the party's progressive wing has weakened." Again, Again, Sydney Ember doesn't include any figures either, but she contends that Sanders' grip on the party and his support have weakened. Sydney Ember's next hit piece, which was an all-out takedown attempt, she tries to portray Bernie Sanders and his campaign as nothing but a bunch of sexists, not once mentioning that back in 2017, it was widely reported that there were also sexual harassment claims in the Clinton campaign. This bias should come as no surprise either when we look into who Sydney Ember is, the daughter of multi-millionaire producer Matt Ember, and daughter-in-law of the former CEO of Bain & Company, one of the biggest consultancies in the world. Not only is Sydney Ember from a powerful, wealthy family, but she herself used to be a Wall Street analyst, according to her own LinkedIn. Before joining the New York Times and writing these 3 Sanders hit pieces, she was an analyst at BlackRock, Wall Street's biggest money manager. And if you're wondering who's hiring these people, who's allowing these poor editorial decisions to be made, consider that the majority shareholder of the New York Times is billionaire Carlos Slim, who recently gave between $1 and $5 million to the Clinton Foundation. So if you're confused as to why one of the most reputable newspapers in the world is running headlines like these and allowing its journalists to flood their Twitter feeds with negative Sanders stories, maybe, just maybe, consider that the majority shareholder of the Times and the rest of the media establishment have no interest in allowing candidates like Bernie Sanders to secure the nomination, and ultimately, it's the powerful few like Carlos Slim at the top who hire people like Sydney Ember and Jonathan Martin, people who decide that rather than report the news, we're going to do our best to create it.